Good morning, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Our guest for this episode is Brian Hanlon, President and CEO of California YIMBY, a statewide pro-housing advocacy organization. Its mission is to make communities throughout California more affordable and inclusive. He also co-founded the California Renters Legal Advocacy and Education Fund, or CARLA, back in 2015. He's a resident of the Bay Area. Thank you so much for being here today, Brian.
Thank you for having me.
To start, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and how you got interested in housing policy?
Sure. So I'm originally from the Boston area, but I grew up in the DC suburbs in Virginia. I've always been interested and always loved cities. Growing up in the suburbs, I really hated the suburbs, and I would lie to my parents and go to punk shows in DC, and say I was going somewhere else with friends, and knew that I wanted to live in cities. I got really interested in housing though when I moved to San Francisco in 2010 and lived in the Mission District. Shortly thereafter, the second tech boom began, rents started skyrocketing, and a number of my neighbors were being evicted through no fault of their own. They were paying their rent, they were doing everything right, and still they were being evicted. So I started getting involved with local tenant rights groups to protest landlords who were evicting my neighbors. And then through there, I really got into this housing rabbit hole, which caused me to change careers, and here I am today.
Well, your organization is called California YIMBY. Can you please tell us what NIMBY means and also what YIMBY means?
Sure. So a NIMBY it stands for not in my backyard. And it's like these are people who say no to things, in this case, housing. So traditionally, NIMBYs specifically oppose affordable housing, low-income housing, homeless shelters, and they continue to do so. NIMBYs also support, though, market rate housing for middle-income people or even upper-income people. They tend to oppose it all. Whereas the YIMBY is the inverse. We believe that we like our neighbors and we want more neighbors. We believe that communities should be welcoming to outsiders, as well as be responsive to the needs of current residents. So we say yes to housing at all levels of affordability. So whether it's, I actually live right across the street from a large shelter for unhoused folks. We support more shelters and permanent supportive housing, as well as low-income housing, senior housing, which actually is right also on my block, and new market rate housing, which for me is a few blocks away. So we say yes to it all, and we believe that that's necessary in order to create inclusive, vibrant communities for everyone.
Okay, so the mission then, it sounds like, of California YIMBY is to support housing in all of its forms from the very bottom to the very top. So you might, the organization might support, a luxury development that was being built as well as a homeless
Correct.
shelter. Okay. You've talked about the three Ps. What are they and why are they
Sure.
important?
So I should step back. The point of California YIMBY isn't just to advocate for homes because we like new buildings. It's because housing is so foundational to everything else that we care about, right? Housing is really the platform for access to healthy communities and for healthcare, for access to quality education, for access to economic opportunity and good jobs, for access to social networks, including family, friends, and child caregiving networks. And so being able to afford safe, secure, stable housing in an area where you want to be is really important in order to achieve all the other things. So the three Ps are what we and many other housing advocates view as a comprehensive housing policy framework. So the P stand for production. So that's building homes, again, at all levels of affordability. It's preservation, preserving existing affordable homes to make sure that they don't become unaffordable, especially for the current residents. And then protection, specifically protecting renters and other vulnerable community members from threats of a displacement.
Do all three P's have to work together, or could we implement just preservation and protection without the first P of production?
Yeah. Well, if you did that, right? I mean, so what some communities have tried that, right? So if you look at especially some of the like the coastal wealthy progressive communities in California, places like Berkeley and Santa Monica, for many years made it really difficult to build any new housing. But they did try to preserve housing that was that was already deed restricted affordable, which is different than just being affordable, and they passed strong rent control. And so what happens over time is, provided that you're in your home and you like your home, you get to stay in your home, and that's great, right? I mean, like, community members should not be pushed out of the communities that they're in. The problem is, every time that someone leaves, right, like you move, the person moving into that unit is going to be wealthier than the person who left the unit. And over decades, what we've seen in these communities that don't build more housing is that they get much wealthier, and they get much more segregated, right? So like Berkeley, for instance, the black population has just collapsed in Berkeley, in large measure because it is such an unaffordable city now, where the median home price is well north of $1 million a home. So the thing is, like, it just like doesn't work. Like, you can't just do preservation and protection without production. On the flip side, if you only did production, then what happens is you can have real bad short-term impacts. So if you take, say, the Bay Area, which I'm most familiar with, where you had this massive jobs boom, right? Firms were hiring highly compensated engineers and business development people and intellectual property attorneys and all the rest far faster than anyone could build housing. I mean, even if we passed SB 50 and other like pro housing rules, there's no way that they could have built housing fast enough, in a safe manner, in order to prevent the prices from spiking over a short time period. And of course, that would have then led to displacement of many folks who are currently there. So I believe it is really important that all of these different aspects of housing policy move in tandem with one another.
Okay, so as you know, California YIMBY's two signature initiatives, SB 827 and SB 50, did focus on the production aspect through upzoning. They generated national headlines. Unfortunately, both failed. Could you explain the concepts behind the bills and walk us through what would have changed if they had
Sure.
passed?
So SB 827 and SB 50 focus on what's sometimes called upzoning, which basically just means making multifamily housing legal to build. What a lot of folks don't know is it is illegal to build housing where more than one family can live in the vast majority of urban land in the United States, including in some of our densest cities, like in Los Angeles, for instance. It is residentially zoned land. It is set more than 70% legally zoned for single family homes. Because if you were a developer and you wanted to build a duplex, they would, like, a court would order you to demolish half of it if you actually managed to build it, or they'd send you to prison, right? I mean, it is illegal to do. In San Francisco, it is illegal to build more than a duplex, in the vast majority of the city. And so what we're saying is, look, if we're building enough housing for everyone in an environmentally sustainable way, where we're not sprawling out forever, and if you want to build affordable housing, which is not single family homes, it needs to be legal to build multifamily housing, especially near transit, especially in areas of high economic opportunity. And so that's what these bills focused on. I will say, though, like, they certainly didn't ignore the preservation or production angles, though. So one, right, like, no one housing bill does everything. Like, that's why there are many bills and not just one housing bill each year. And California YIMBY was proud to support any number of other bills that more directly dealt with tenant protections and preserving affordable housing than SB 50. But SB 50 also had incredibly strong renter protections, where a developer could not use the SB 50 benefit on any parcel where a renter had lived for the past 7 years. I mean, it was really restrictive. The idea there being that we don't want this bill to incent the displacement of people at all. So that was a really strong protection there. Also, you could not use the bill to demolish like existing like deed restricted affordable housing. So you couldn't lose the existing affordable housing that we had to a new building that would have been authorized under SB 50.
So you mentioned a couple of interesting things. Obviously, there is this huge jobs boom that's happening throughout the Bay Area right now because of the rise of the tech industry. You did mention also that because of this jobs boom, the demand for housing has increased to the point where it's hard to picture any scenario of production that would be able to keep up with the demand. How much, if these single family homes were redeveloped into duplexes and fourplexes and what have you, or 6 to 8 unit apartment buildings near transit stations, how much actual affordable housing would be produced, or would these new units be renting out for extremely high prices like we see throughout the Bay Area?
Yeah. So one thing I'll say, it is possible to build enough housing to meet demand, even in high demand areas of Bay housing. What my earlier point meant is that there's a time lag in that companies can hire engineers faster than builders can build housing, right? And so there will be a 1 to several year time period where there's a real crunch, but housing production, if it's legal, will eventually catch up to the folks who are moving here and who want to move here. So I do think it is very possible for California to build enough housing to meet its needs. It's not going to happen right away. In terms of like affordability, so a bill like SB 50 would have massively increased the amount of affordable housing through 2 mechanisms. One, it would have directly built it, right? And so in order to build housing under SB 50, if you're building in these transit areas, these larger buildings, you have to include a certain percentage of on-site affordable housing. And there were a menu of options, like you could do everything from extremely low to very low to low income. So like all the different what are called AMIs, area median income, so folks who are very, very poor, to folks who are just working class, would have had affordable homes in this. The feasibility analysts that we used modeled the impacts of SB 50 and found that in the 9-county Bay Area alone, so not even including the rest of the state, SB 50 would have created more deed-restricted affordable housing for low-income people than currently exists. In other words, that this one bill would have built more affordable housing than the sum total efforts of every single local, state, and federal policy since California was a state in 150 years, right? So, I mean, it's massive, massive bill. It also would have created lots of affordable housing through preventing housing from becoming unaffordable, right? Because people see, oh, look at all this new housing, it's expensive. It's like, well, yeah, like new stuff is expensive. A new car is a lot more expensive than a used car. It's just how it is. But over time, housing becomes more affordable if it is sited in an area where it's legal to build housing. What we have in the Bay Area is old housing just gets really expensive because we're not building any more of it. So there are plenty of communities in the Bay Area that build next to no new housing, and you go there and the housing's like, it's not nice. Like, these are like not nice apartments, and they're incredibly expensive. Like you would get a palace, almost anywhere else in the country for the rents of these, old, like dilapidated apartments. So SB 50 would have stopped that dynamic from worsening.
So there is an inclusionary zoning component of SB 50 then?
Correct.
Okay. So had SB 50 been approved, were you confident that the local governments and their permitting processes would have been adequate to permit the large new pipeline of new redevelopment that would have been coming? In Hawaii, we've had some challenges with that.
So I think it depends on the city. I think that local governments that have trouble because it's their policy to have trouble, right? So and what I mean by that is in the vast majority of the wealthy world, and this is true in most countries, and true in most states, if a developer submits an application for a project, it goes to a civil servant. That civil servant looks like, okay, does it meet all of our zoning rules? Then it goes to someone who can understand, okay, does it meet all the building codes, all the safety requirements? Is the electrical system like makes sense, not gonna hurt anyone, right? If it meets all the requirements, then they're issued their permits and they can build. Um, in California, and I think this is the way it's applied too, it is very different, right? So in most cities in California, at least in most cities where there's development demand to build new housing, even if it complies with rules, they hold public hearings and public comments, and city council members vote on it. It's really weird that it gets in the political process. This also is an invitation for corruption, I would add, and it's ensnared a number of elected leaders in Los Angeles right now. There's a huge scandal down there. But that's what happens when you have a discretionary housing approval process. So in cities that have really onerous processes, and places like Berkeley, yeah, I think they would have been jammed up a little bit, but a way around that would be if they simplified their housing approval process. Then they would be able to only focus on do these applications meet the rules? Do they meet their safety requirements? If so, they meet the requirements. Should be no problem.
Okay, so can you paint the picture a little bit? So let's say that SB 50 had passed. Play the tape for us. What would the housing landscape have looked like, after 1 year, after 2 years, after 5 years, after 10 years in the Bay Area, just to take one example?
I mean, in my head right now, I'm just thinking that old scene in The Simpsons where Lionel Hutz imagines like what would the world look like without lawyers? It's like all the world's people like dancing and holding arms in a field, kind of like that. So look, housing takes time to build. And so you would not have seen a radical transformation overnight. I think what you would have seen is in some areas where you have vacant or significantly underutilized land, very high demand areas. I'm thinking along like the Caltrain corridor in Silicon Valley. Caltrain is it's a commuter rail system. You would have housing pretty quickly built there. I mean, you have such incredible demand, such massive jobs and housing imbalances down there. You would have seen a lot of transformation pretty quickly. The truth of the matter is, though, in existing neighborhoods, change would be very piecemeal and over a longer period of time. Like if you think, especially because of the restrictions in SB 50, where you couldn't develop in an area like on a parcel the tenant had lived there the past 7 years, right? I mean, that's like much of San Francisco, for instance, right? Is just automatically, X'd out, except for the single family home areas and some commercial corridors. So in those places, like not as much. There was also in areas that were deemed sensitive communities, and so places that have like higher levels of poverty or displacement, there was an extra, like nothing would take place for at least 5 years. And so there'd be additional time to do community planning in those places. And so SB 50 wouldn't have any impact there for 50 years. But I would say in places like Oakland, where I live, you've already seen, in recent years, a fair number of development downtown. I think you would see some more missing middle, smaller scale buildings, like between like 8 to 8 units, that sort of thing, in the neighborhoods that are near transit stations and that are in wealthy neighborhoods. But that would happen over time as individual owners wanted to sell. So the 3.5 million figure I cited, it's not clear how long that would take to happen. That's the number of units that would be economically profitable to build, even given all the affordable housing requirements in SB 50 at the time of passage. But it would take time.
All right. So we don't know if it would have been a 5-year thing or a time year 10 horizon, but at some point, supply would have caught up to demand, in your opinion.
At some point, yes. But again, like SB 50, like anything else, is not a silver bullet. Well, it was the most meaningful bill that I think anyone's proposed to solve the housing crisis. It wouldn't do it alone. In order to really get enough home building in California, we need bills like SB 50 to make it legal to build. We also, as you alluded earlier, streamline the housing approval process. It just takes so long here, which is really expensive and really boxes out a lot of smaller developers who don't have the money to hire political consultants and land use attorneys to navigate the system, effectively bribe local nonprofits and politicians, which is really common around here. So we would need a form of streamlining. Also, we need some ways to like knock down these incredibly high fees for home building. In some California cities, just getting the permission to build a single unit of housing would be over $200,000. The median price for a home in the United States is around $230,000, $240,000. I mean, it's crazy how much money we charge just for the permission to build when we so desperately need more homes. We need to tackle that issue as well.
So, as you might know, Cambridge, Massachusetts is adopting some version of the upzoning concept. They're considering a so-called affordable housing overlay, which allows upzoning only if the new units are 100% affordable. Is there a reason you didn't go with that concept, or do you support that concept?
Sure, but it wouldn't build anywhere near enough, right? I mean, look, I think that's good. I know some of the folks at a better Cambridge, the absolute, if support that effort, and I support it. Like, sure, do it. But again, it's also like important to note though that, well, like I very much care about affordable housing and creating economically and racially integrated communities where everyone belongs. There are plenty of people who say they care about those things, but don't actually, but they use requirements like very high affordable housing ratios for new home building because they know it's not economically viable to do. And so there's a long history of this in California. I mean, even going back to the 70s, like at transcripts like city council and county board of supervisors meetings saying, oh, we should just require a really high percentage of affordable housing because then nothing will get built. So you just need to be really careful with this kind of stuff and make sure that the math works. And I don't know all the details of the Cambridge Group plan, but the fact of the matter is there's a massive housing shortage in Cambridge, in Somerville, in the Boston area. It's very similar to the Bay Area. And policies like that just aren't going to come anywhere near close to getting what we need to do.
Okay, so let's move on to another bill that did pass. In 2019, California did pass AB 68, an ADU law, with your support. Can you introduce the concept to us and describe what the effects of AB 68 have been?
Sure. So California YIMBY was very proud to sponsor AB 68, which is a bill that builds upon existing accessory dwelling unit law. So think like granny flats or in-law unit, in order to make the existing programs actually possible to get things built. And so again, there's like, I joke that California is mostly led by consultants and lawyers that have erected these incredibly complicated systems, and the only way to understand them is to hire consultants and lawyers. And then even then, almost nothing gets done because it's just so they've altered the market in such a way only very expensive housing is profitable to build. And so ADU law was sort of similar in that the state recognized that immigrants were unfairly throwing up these roadblocks to more naturally affordable homes. And so they stepped in and passed some laws, but they just weren't anywhere near powerful enough. And so in 2018, there was another effort to pass ADU laws that did that, and they failed. And then so we came in 2019 and said, okay, look, like let's like work with some of the folks who've been active in this space for a while, and let's get this done. And so AB 68 removes many of the barriers that prevented ADUs from getting approved. So in California now, thanks to AB 68, it is legal to build an accessory dwelling unit, like an external cottage, and what we call a junior accessory dwelling unit inside the existing primary home. But you can, I think, build out was like 15%. Like you can build a new entryway or something, right? If you need to. And so this really radically shifted things. And I think like what you've seen on the practical side, the effect is, again, if you change policy and to build housing, it takes years before you really see like the full effects. What you have seen is a ton of new firms that specialize in building ADUs, or in financing ADUs, or in navigating the approvals process for ADUs, pop up because now this is like a profitable thing to do. And so this is exciting, right? Like this is like a good thing. And I was recently on a I watched the meeting, which I'd recommend all your viewers do as well, from the UC Berkeley Center, Turner Center for Housing Innovation, where they had in a bunch of their housing innovator companies that they help that they worked with, and they all praised the new ADU laws for basically creating an environment where their businesses were viable in California. So the short answer is, in places like LA, you've seen ADUs skyrocket, where they're now 20% of new permits. I mean, just really huge numbers here. But I think that's only the tip of the iceberg for what's going to happen in coming years as more homeowners understand what their rights are under state law, and they partner with companies who can help them with the financing and building and designing of the ADUs.
So, do you have any examples of jurisdictions that have successfully ended housing shortages, either through, an ADU approach or an upzoning approach, similar to the ones that you've been advocating?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was funny. I spoke with a number of economists and planners trying to model the impacts of SB 50 in a number of ways, including like, what's this going to do to like land prices? And they were like, no one's ever tried doing this before. Like, we don't know. The just like the massive upzoning of SB 50 across such wide geographies in so many incredibly expensive areas. To my knowledge, no one has ever tried doing that before, and it hasn't been done in the United States. I think yeah, so I don't know. And I mean, I think if you look at how other places, well, let me step back. If you look to how California used to develop, it used to have more of the system that I'm not talking about. And so I don't know what you call them in Hawaii, but in LA, right, you have like the dingbats, these, it's like a first floor is for the cars, and like second and third floors, like where people live, their apartments. A ton of these were built in like the middle of the century in LA. They were often built by very small scale developers who were often self-financing. Those are then income properties for them. And they were building them in existence where single family homes used to have been. In San Francisco, in a neighborhood called the Richmond, they were called Richmond Specials. You would demolish a single family home and build a 3-flat. In Berkeley, where I used to live in South Berkeley, it was very common that after a single family home was near the end of its useful life, it'd be demolished, and they would build like an 12 unit small apartment building on that site. And prices weren't going up, right? That's how California used to maintain its level of affordability. Well, the problem is a bunch of folks didn't like that. And so Berkeley, for instance, which I'm more familiar with here, in 1973 passed something called the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance. And they just killed that kind of new home building. And so the results are predictable. A lot of poor people, a lot of Black Berkeleyans got pushed out. Prices got higher, and the city became wealthier and wealthier and more exclusionary and expensive.
So speaking of that, I mean, I think one trend that we see both in California and nationwide, including in Hawaii, is that at one time there was a very permissive, regulatory environment that allowed people to build a lot. And for some reason, during this era of the 1960s and 70s, there was a huge pushback to that model, and a lot of, like you were just mentioning, the 1973 Berkeley bill. Now, do you think the pendulum has shifted to the other direction now? Have we successfully changed the conversation in housing since California YIMBY's foundation?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think that not like, to our own horns here, but yeah, I mean, like SB 827 really was this sort of like shockwave through, I think, like the housing discussion nationwide. I remember I spoke with a designer for the city of New York, and he said the head of their department actually had an all-staff meeting and like shut down business for a day to talk about SB 827, what it could mean for New York, right? I mean, so it's just, I think that we've made a tremendous amount of progress in the few short years that we've been around, but no, we haven't declared victory yet, right? Like, we haven't achieved victory yet. There's still a lot more to be done. Some more folks, I need to be convinced that this is like the right approach. I think like to me, part of the one of the really like sad ironies of all these downzonings is that like I'm a very personally a very progressive person. Like California YIMBY is a nonpartisan organization, but like I'm very uh, personally progressive, and it is it's like it's unfortunate that like other folks who like identify as progressives and like agree with me on things like policing reforms and like um, public health and like other issues think that saying no to home building is somehow progressive, but it's disastrous. I mean, there's overwhelming academic evidence and overwhelming real world evidence that these types of programs hurt the very people that some progressives say that they're trying to help. Like not building housing enriches the existing homeowners in a state like California are much whiter and older than the rest of the state and disproportionately harm renters and younger people.
So do you think that with this wave of new momentum, that if we, come back in 10 years, that California will no longer have a housing shortage?
God willing, right? I mean, if we do our jobs right, yeah, if we do our jobs right, look, I think it's possible. I mean, I I don't downplay the difficulties of the politics here. I mean, I know them pretty acutely now. But it is possible. It's funny. I was talking with this one attorney. She's a law professor in Connecticut. She's been fighting for fair housing for years. Connecticut famously has many small exclusionary suburbs with their really nice school systems and their almost entirely white residents that restrict home building quite severely, especially affordable home building. And when some people on Twitter were like, "Oh, SB 50 failed in the Senate," and she's like, "It got 18 votes. I can't believe it got more than one vote, right?" Like it's like kind of like remarkable that we had 18 votes, 15 no votes, and two other votes we did have that would have been I votes. It was but they didn't want to go up until 2021. We were one vote short for getting out of that chamber. And so I think that's just like a monumental victory from where we were a few years ago. And if we're able to keep it up, then yeah, like I do think we're going to pass big bills in the near term.
All right. So we've talked a lot about the market end of the real estate development spectrum, and you've mentioned that you do support government subsidies to build truly affordable housing at the lower end too. Can you talk about some of those efforts in that respect
Yeah,
that you've undertaken?
yeah, sure. So we typically don't lead in those areas. We support the efforts of other organizations. So in California, there's a really robust ecosystem of affordable housing nonprofits and affordable housing advocacy organizations. Like they have their own lobbyists, they have their own policy people, they have their organizers, and like they have their own agenda. And so instead of trying to do their agenda for them, we work with them to support what they're asking for. And so one of the bigger initiatives of the past few years was this bill called SB2, which was authored by Pro Tem Atkins, the head of the California State Senate, which would have imposed what's called like a document recording fee on certain real estate transactions. And that fee would go to an affordable housing trust fund, which could then be used to fund permanent affordable housing. We were huge advocates for it. Like we mobilized for it. We did office visits. We directed calls. California YIMBY is at its heart a grassroots advocacy organization. We have 80,000 members throughout the state of California, or 25 local YIMBY team chapters, as well as partnerships with many existing independent YIMBY organizations in the state. And so like we really, did what we could in order to pass that bill, and it just got it through. So that was exciting. We've also supported other efforts to increase funding for affordable housing, where we are co-sponsoring a ballot initiative to repeal what's called Article 34, which is just bluntly a racist proposition that was made part of the California Constitution in 1950. That was an effort to keep low rent housing outside of cities. So yeah, I mean, like we're definitely engaged in that fight, but I don't want to pretend that we're leading that fight. Like we see our appropriate role as supporting the efforts of the existing affordable housing advocacy organization.
speaking of these victories, whether it's SB2 or AB68, can you share with some of our listeners some of the tactics that you found were successful in these fights?
So,
Maybe we can employ some of them here.
all right. So, like, I mean, it kind of depends. I don't know if I should say this, but so, right, like SB50 was just such a shockwave, just really just took all the action out of the room. And so, right, the same year, like in 2019, we introduced SB50. We also had AB68. If you notice, we didn't say anything about AB68 in the press. We kept quiet about it. And our goals there were to sort of look, we worked, I mean, sleepless nights, really worked our tails off to pass SB50. Unfortunately, came out short. But our strategy with AB68 was just to have, to work directly with the staff of members of the legislature to make sure they understood the bill, make sure they understood like why we were doing it, to solicit their feedback and incorporate comments from some folks who are a bit critical, and then to just like do the hard work of polite and persistent lobbying in Sacramento. And I think we were able to really make the case that, hey, SB50 is what we really want, but AB68 is like, it's like ADU is a spraying flat, it's tiny. And it worked. And I'll tell you, not 24 hours after after the legislature passed that bill. By the way, I really need to give credit here to Assemblymember Phil Ting, who was the author of AB68 and is really like excellent staff, right? I mean, like we're the sponsor, but like the author is the one who ultimately passes the bill. And so like we worked very, very closely with the Assemblymember and his staff in order to get this done. And, so less than 24 hours later, the legislature passes it, and Lewis, our legislative director, and I are in LA at a party, and he just like walks up to me like laughing, like, I can't believe that worked. Like we passed AB68. Just like our like goal was to just shut up about it publicly and just like do the work in Sacramento, and it worked. Now that doesn't always work, right? Like that because we had SB50, like that kind of plan like was viable. But I do think there's also like this is like a lesson that should be obvious, but that is not to all of us in Sacramento. Don't count off any votes and don't take any votes for granted. Like do the work and follow up with every single office multiple times. Make sure the staff understands the bill, and then like really try to get them to an I vote. We were able to get support from certain members for bills that before, like we never would have thought that we would have received. Quite frankly, I mean, SB50 was one of them. It was a really interesting bedfellows coalition, including the co-authors for the bill, right? I mean, Senator Scott Wiener is, very progressive state senator from San Francisco, a very progressive city. Nancy Skinner, who's just like the OG of progressive housing policy in California, was the principal co-author from Berkeley, right? Progressive. But the two of them ended up working with some more moderate Democrats and some conservative Republicans who also supported the bill. And oftentimes people supported the bill for their own different reasons, but they did support it. And so, I think like walking into these coalitions with an open mind is also really important.
Anything you found was a waste of time that you would not do in the future for any of these
Oh
fights?
yeah, stuff I probably can't say publicly. Anything I can say publicly? That's a really good question. If we were doing this like event after hours and we were like drinking over Zoom, then like maybe I'd share. Nothing right
All
now.
right.
Nothing right now. You'll have to come back to me on that one.
Okay. Does California YIMBY have national chapters, or is it just one organization?
So California YIMBY is we're one organization, but we have many local teams, and those teams are spread out throughout California. We do not operate nationally yet. Maybe in the future we will, and we'll change our name or something. But I think it's just like, well, it's important to be sort of flexible to opportunity. It's also important to have goals and to hit those goals. And right now, trying to build up a national organization and trying to achieve actual concrete victories at the same time, which is practically impossible. And so we're focused on California at the moment. Even though like I do talk with folks you right now in Hawaii, with folks in Massachusetts and Virginia and DC and Maryland and Seattle and Portland and like other places.
Okay. Um, let's see. All right. So maybe if we take a step back and look at the big picture for a
Sure.
moment, um, it seems like there's kind of this fundamental tension between those who would say, you know what, housing is so important that we need to, for instance, have the state government come in and restrict the ability of local communities to prevent housing from being built. And on the other hand, folks who might say, well, there are some communities, I don't know what they are, maybe Bruges in Belgium or Venice, Italy, or the entire state of Hawaii, which has such a unique ecosystem, more endangered species than any other place in the United States. Maybe we can upzone and redevelop places like Berkeley, California, but as for these other communities, we should fossilize them in amber. We should absolutely not change anything at all, ever. And, surely those communities do exist, right? Um, do you agree that there is some limit to
Yeah.
redevelopment?
So some of it, yes, I certainly agree that there's some of it. Like I tell you, there are plenty of folks in Berkeley who think that the Earth Goddess built Berkeley in its most perfect form, and it should be that way forever, right? So like they exist there too. I mean, look, I think like lots of folks think that their particular town is like a special snowflake that is so unique and should not be changed. And I just don't subscribe to that theory. Now, this is an interesting question. So, like, is there any city in the United States that meets that criteria? Like, no, I don't think so. Although, sure, if you're talking about a much like older place, like you mentioned, like some beautiful European cities, like, what do we do about Paris, right? I remember I was talking to friends of mine in Paris about this very issue, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's what we call the museumification of Paris here, right? This sort of sense that Paris is this, perfect little jewel for the world, and it doesn't need to meet the needs of the residents who are there now. To be clear, like Paris is a really dynamic international city with like, tons of immigrants from all over the world. It's not just this sort of Disneyland like center part around like the Louvre and the sort of Eiffel Tower. And so even there, I think, yeah, there are lots of opportunities to build even in Paris, which is the densest city in the Western world. Um, but like getting back to, let's talk about Hawaii. I had the fortune to visit the Big Island a number of years ago, and yeah, it is really beautiful, really, really outstanding. Never been anywhere else like it in the world. I think that Hawaii does have a lot of land that should be preserved in the state that it's in right now. That said, Hawaii, like every other country in the state, has tons of suburban sprawl as well. You have tons of urban areas that have already been built, they've already been paved over. That yes, like you should redevelop those places to meet the needs of Hawaiians today, right? I mean, Hawaii, like it depends on the metric that you use. Either Hawaii or California have the worst overcrowding rate in the country. Like you are not meeting the needs of your residents today, to say nothing of the people in the future. So I do think that you need to build more housing. But just like in California, like I wouldn't support building housing in some of these beautiful parks that we have, even in the Bay Area or in LA, like even urban parks. I mean, obviously everyone's like Yosemite is its own sort of special, amazing thing. But yeah, like I like part of the reason that I so support more dense urban infill housing is precisely to stop us from paving over and these like more rural or agricultural or even they're not really wild lands in California, but wildish places to prevent that from happening.
So what about suburbs themselves? What about those who would say, you know what, suburbs are a unique and beautiful way of life. Presidents Hoover and Coolidge called the automobile suburbs um, some of the proudest accomplishments of the American people.
Yeah.
People love having their backyards. They love the ability to, have their kids run through the streets without fear of traffic mowing them down, and they love their quarter-acre lots. And people really, are willing clearly to pay a lot of money for that. What is their limit? What is the limit on their ability to say, well, this community will be like this forever and ever?
Yeah. So look, this is the tricky thing with democracy, right? Like different people have different interests and different wants. The one I'll say, I know that people think the suburbs are safer. The car injury and fatality rate is much higher in the suburbs than it is in central cities in the United States. It's not even close. So like parents who think that they're being safer, their kids being able to play in the streets in suburbs are mistaken. But look, I understand. So one thing, look, if you have a backyard and you like your backyard, then keep your backyard. Don't sell your home, right? I mean, like, you can have that. Now the question is, do you get to tell your neighbors that they also need to have a backyard there, and they can't build like a courtyard building so more families can live there? To me, this is about like weighing different priorities. I understand, like I don't think it's totally invalid that someone buys into a neighborhood like, this is nice. I don't want it to ever change. Like, okay, like. Sure, I get that. But then it's like you put those bucket of aesthetic preferences and like other desires on one hand, and then, well, I think climate change is really serious, and could lead to the inability of this planet to sustain a large human population. That would just lead to massive suffering and immiseration and civil strife and like warfare. Like we need to lower greenhouse gas emissions and build more dense housing. We need to halt this increasing wealth inequality, which is largely about housing in the United States. We need to make a real progress on economic and racial segregation, which has been going in the wrong direction in many communities for many years. We need, and then like other communities, and then like other people, just like, I just want a place to live. You put all those concerns against the other concerns, and I think the people who want more homes, I think those concerns are simply more important than the other concerns, even though they have validity.
All right. So if you were starting, let's say you got the opportunity to become the mayor of a new city on totally undeveloped land, and you, as the dictator, could prescribe whatever land regulations you wanted. How would that look?
Yeah. So part of it, what kind of labor market do I have, right? I mean, like part of it, like really depends. So this is funny. I did this like urban design program one summer 6 years ago, and we had to come up with our vision for how we were going to redevelop the space, like including like use, scale, everything, and the design of the individual buildings. And I was very intentional. I'm like, well, look, this is like my sort of vision and scale, but I would first of all hire different architects to do each individual building. Like I don't want to do like one thing. I think like the most interesting communities are typically those that weren't built all at once. And I don't want to be too prescriptive, because maybe I have an idea for how people want to use space, but maybe that's not how they want to use it. Like I might be wrong. So I know this is sort of cheating because I'm like rejecting the premise of your sort of thought experiment here. But I just that's just like not how I think about cities. That said, yeah, it would depend. I'll tell you, like I like all kinds of cities. I think Tokyo is one of the most exciting and fascinating places in the world, and it's this real jumble too of density and types. I mean, while there are tall buildings in some areas, most of Tokyo is like 3 stories. It's like not that tall. There are the sort of, we talked about Paris earlier, these sort of like beautiful traditional like walking cities that are more 5 to 8 story scale in Europe or South America. Really gorgeous and wonderful too. I like them also. So I don't know. It really depends where. The climate is like too. How rich are we? What do we all do for a living? I don't know. It's just like too impossible for me to answer. I like all kinds of cities.
Well, so then does it sound like that you would prefer, a city with no zoning, like most of American cities built, before 1900, or like a city like Houston
Yeah,
today.
it is. Although, I mean, I think like Houston actually beats just like a lot of like progressive cities on equity metrics in a lot of ways, which is really embarrassing for us. Houston, those still have, they have really strict parking requirements in a lot of places, and like other types of rules that really influence what the built environment looks like. So like, the fact that they don't have technical zoning is not as important as it often sounds. And the suburbs of Houston almost all have zoning. Um, the yeah, I don't know. I think it is this like funny paradox where like a lot of people who like say that they most care about space and the impact of place and all the rest, they have these really prescriptive rules, and yet all their favorite places were built without any of those rules. Like, what does that say? Maybe we don't need them to have great spaces.
Well, on the other side of the coin, you talked about Paris, and Paris, as you know, is famous for the urban renewal of Baron Haussmann in the late 19th century, where it was one guy who, basically rebuilt a lot of it. And yet people love it, even though it's what we would consider really authoritarian and top down today without a lot. In fact, it was against neighborhood input because he didn't want the people of Paris to rise up in a new revolution. So he was expressly trying to crush neighborhood and community
So that's
opinion.
all true, but also I think a bit overdone. The in terms of like the medieval city of Paris, the it's not a grid, but like the streetways were significantly changed by Haussmann, but most of the original streets were still there. I mean, yeah, those big diagonal boulevards that he cut through the existing built environment, right? So you can have like troop movements to quell urban uprisings. Yeah, that's true. That's there. He was prescriptive on like the heights and the setback requirements. Um, that said, there are a bunch of cities. In fact, almost all the other cities in Europe did not have this sort of powerful dictator designer build it, and they don't look all that different, right? Like the feel of a lot of those cities isn't so distinct. So I don't think it's necessary. Um, but I say, look, I really love Paris, and I love, but I actually just learned yesterday, like my favorite neighborhood in Paris is like the 11th, like there are like 20 numbered neighborhoods or only small. I can't pronounce French. Forgive me. In Paris, and I just learned yesterday when looking at the density demographics. So the 11th is far and away the densest neighborhood in the city, and it really is like it's like full of like different types of people and immigrants from all over the world, different types of shops. It's exciting. It's not this sort of Disneylandish Paris that I think a lot of American tourists know. Um, but yeah, and again, like I had friends like when they lived in Paris, they lived in these like ugly 14-story public housing projects, right? I mean, it's a diverse city. I I could be happy to live in a city that was designed somewhat around Baron von Haussmann's designs. I'd also be very happy to live in a space that more organically developed over time, or that
Maybe the
haphazardly
modern
developed after it was bombed, right? I mean, like so much of Tokyo developed as a slum. Like you had local people just buy ready mixed concrete and rebar, and make their own places, like rebuild their own neighborhoods. You got like you go to like Shimakitazawa, like you still see the exposed rebar. It's almost like looks like it's bombed out, although it wasn't. They just like rebuilt it after the bombing, and it's still amazing, right? So I don't know. I guess like I'm someone who it's funny. I almost went to grad school for photography. This is like a whole aside. It's like I am someone who does think a lot about like design and aesthetics, but I'm not prescriptive in my preferences for what that they should be other people's preferences too. And I do think it's that Paris aside, most of the world's greatest spaces were not designed by some master builder. In fact, the master plan cities are mostly all terrible, right? Like the livability and the design of most sort of 20th century cities where they were, built intentionally, like often these were capital cities that were rebuilt, not known for their great urbanism. Um, I would say some of the spaces in this country that were, built to be like public squares, like open squares, like they're terrible and sterile because they're so over over designed and over prescribed, like what uses can occur there, what kind of businesses can be there. They're not interesting, and there's certainly nothing. I mean, I haven't been to Rome, but like based on photos I've seen, it's like nothing like what Rome is like.
Another master builder, planner, maybe the modern Haussmann, was, of course, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, who built 82% of the housing in that country. And it's been held up as a model. We've studied it quite a bit here in Hawaii.
Yeah.
We've, been there. We've led delegations. We've engaged with experts from Singapore. What do you think about the Singapore public housing
It's,
model?
I think it's fantastic. I mean, look, I like Singapore is in extraordinary. I haven't had the pleasure of visiting. I'd love to, but based on what I've read, like Singapore is an extraordinary city across many different dimensions. I mean, like the fact that Singapore survived and thrived is itself is like an unbelievable miracle. Like the story of that place is really mind blowing. I think that model was well. I'm gonna not comment on some of the more authoritarian aspects or some of their residential requirements or some of the ways that they give housing to families, like heterosexual families. Like there are other parts of their housing policy that I don't really love. But if we're just talking about, the way that they enabled housing to be developed, just the structures, that probably makes more sense in other forms because like they did like reclaim a fair amount of land. It's like tiny little tip, right? They're very limited in terms of the space they had, and I do think that this kind of like visionary leader approach to building makes sense in Singapore. Now, then the question is, does that approach make sense anywhere in the United States, where we don't have all the sort of things that made Singapore so like such an extraordinary project that just simply are not applicable here? I don't know. I do think that's something that we can borrow from Singapore, however, is this like general model of, yeah, like you have a public agency, a housing development board, build and finance housing, not necessarily subsidized housing, that the people who live there, like they pay the cost. It pays for the maintenance and recapitalizes the fund of the housing development board, that then they can then go use that fund to go build and finance more housing, and et cetera. I think there is actually a lot to be said for that model. I think that model, again, makes the most sense in markets where you don't have private capital to invest in large housing, and that is not the market that in-demand urban places in the United States face. But look, it built a lot of housing, and so I don't have a real ideological perspective on, is it better if the private markets build housing? Is it better if government builds housing? I think there are examples in this world of places where private markets do almost everything, where public markets do almost everything, and there are good ends. So it's like, to me, like the question isn't who's building it, is it getting built? That's like the more important question to ask.
Maybe the closest that this country came to the Lee Kuan Yew or Haussmann model would have been the public housing HUD programs that really peaked under the Johnson administration in the 60s and
Yeah.
70s. Now, do you think that those programs were a success or
Yeah.
not?
So it depends. I mean, it really depends on what your criteria are for success, right? I mean, like there are also like different eras. Like there are a number of distinct eras of public housing in the United States. Right, the earliest public housing was housing that was not meant for poor people; it was meant for working people, and there really were dire shortages of quality housing in this country. I mean, like, if you look at the conditions of existing urban housing in the early 20th century, I mean, it's like there was maybe no like indoor plumbing. I mean, it was just terrible. So I think there was a real need uh, uh, through the then. I think that a lot of the so-called failures of public housing are often failures of, well, if you're having a development with nothing but very poor people and there's no maintenance stream, right? Like, well, that's like not a model that's going to work. Like it costs it costs upkeep to, it costs money to upkeep and to manage a building. It doesn't matter if poor people are living there or rich people living there. It costs money. And a lot of these models just like didn't have that, right? They had the money for capital expenses, like building the thing, but not enough for operating expenses. You often had these projects cited in places with not a lot of economic opportunity. Often this was done very intentionally. They were built in racially segregated areas. There were some projects that were built like right adjacent to highways, and this is before we got the lead out of gasoline in this country. I mean, it's terrible, terrible for babies and kids growing up there. So there were a lot of failures, but I do not think that the so-called failures of affordable housing discredit the idea that there is a role for the federal or state governments to play in building social housing. So there are, to your point, like whether it's Singapore, whether we're talking about Vienna, whether we're talking about other places like that, there are examples of places like that have built quality social housing for their residents, and we can learn from them.
All right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Maybe I'll just give you one last question. We didn't get to Carla, the legal fund that you helped start in 2015. Do you want to address that? Just give us a short introduction as to what Carla does, and if you have any concluding thoughts to advice to leave us with, feel free.
Sure. Sonia Traus and I co-founded Carla, the California Renters Legal Advocacy and Education Fund, in 2015. In order to hold cities to account for state housing law. I also had the idea that we were going to do more fair housing impact litigation. We ended not going in that direction because we immediately had a state housing case, and those types of cases just take a lot longer to litigate, and they're much more expensive. So the idea being that California has a lot of laws that restrict the ability of cities to say no to housing, and yet these laws are not enforced. We learned during the course of our lawsuits that, in fact, one of the key laws that we were using to enforce the Housing Accountability Act was simply not strong enough to achieve the sort of victories that we needed to achieve. And so it really informed, like California YIMBY really directly came out of Carla, in the sense that during the course, I am not a lawyer. Like during the course of this lawsuit, I learned, we are going to lose. And if we appeal, we would probably lose. The only way we're going to be successful is if we change the law. And so I worked with, I convened a group of land use attorneys and planners and other folks to figure out, okay, like here are the problems I have with the law, here are my proposed changes, what are your proposed changes? I then rewrote a new version of the Housing Accountability Act. I then gave what I wrote to an actual attorney who rewrote what I wrote. And then I went to work in Sacramento, allies and partners, and worked the bill. And as the bill was moving through the committee process, I had this like, oh my gosh, like this is actually working. Like I'm this guy that had like no real, like no money, no connections, no experience in Sacramento. And yet I'm making progress in what ended up being the most significant, the lawyers for the California League of Cities said that was the most significant bill of the 15 bill 2017 housing package. There were other big bills out of it too, SB 35 especially. And it was like during the course of this process, it was like, wow, like I can actually make change here in Sacramento. And I pitched my vision for a statewide housing advocacy organization that combined policy development and actually writing bills like with practitioners, academics, and policy experts, with coalition building of groups in Sacramento and lobbying elected officials, and then growing a grassroots movement everywhere, especially where we had key votes, so they could lobby in district and exert political pressure on elected officials to support legislation. And I pitched to folks, and they were excited, and it worked, and off to the races. So that's my experience with Carla. Carla is still around, still kicking. I don't have a formal role with the organization. We're like Sonny and I both now do other things. The current executive director, this guy Dylan Casey, is an actual attorney. He's an expert in ADU law, and so California partners with Carla on ADU education work. So we work with them to help educate like local officials and other local communities, like what their opportunities as well as their obligations are under state ADU law.
All right, great. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Our Homes, Ending the Housing Crisis. Thank you so much to our guest, Brian Hanlon in California. Please visit faithactionhawaii.org to get involved with the great work of our partner today, Faith Action for Community Equity. To contact me, Stanley Chang, you can email senchang@capital.hawaii.gov or find me on Facebook. Have a great day, and please stay safe and healthy.